that Ryan Routh has been found guilty on all counts. We're just getting that into our live now from Fox studio. And we were talking, really no surprise to you, as this really was quick deliberations on, on the part of the jury. Can you talk more about the fact that the jury has reached unanimously guilty on all counts?
Well, Stephanie, you got to get 12 out of 12 beyond a reasonable doubt. It's not easy. It's the highest standard under the law. But in this particular case, there was so much evidence that it was Routh at the scene. His DNA was on the firearm. He had burner phones. I mean, all the evidence in the days and weeks leading up to this attempt, that was all laid out for the jurors. And what did Routh do on his side? He said that, again, he didn't pull the trigger. Again, it's not necessary to pull the trigger to be convicted of attempted murder. You just need a substantial step under the law. And everything that Routh did was more than a substantial step. Then he argued essentially that he wasn't trespassing. Again, he wasn't charged with trespassing. He was charged with attempted murder, firearms offenses. Again, not really relevant to the case. And the last was, maybe the firearm was unable to shoot, and he did call firearms experts in his defense. He didn't testify himself. But again, I don't think that was a particularly good argument. Everything he did really pointed to that attempted murder conviction. That's why when it came on, I'm not shy about making predictions, but it was pretty clear the writing was on the wall. It was just a matter of wrapping up those closing arguments, and the jurors, we're going to return a verdict. The fact that it took 2 hours is probably a surprise. The Department of Justice will make their recommendation. I imagine they're going to recommend something along the range of that 30 to life sentence. We saw a similar recommendation recently in the attempted assassination of Justice Kavanaugh, where the government there is recommending 30 years. That individual flew from California to the Maryland area and ended up going to Kavanaugh's home. Some Secret Service individuals were able to deflect this individual, but you could tell where the government's sort of lining up on these attempted assassination cases.
And Nima, I wanted to share this with our viewers right here. Fox News saying that the man accused of trying to assassinate President Donald Trump during his 2024 campaign has been found guilty on all counts. This is the body camera video of when law enforcement took Ryan Routh into custody. That is the suspect now found guilty on all counts. And, Nima, you were talking about that political bent. It's politically charged. And I wanted to ask you, specifically the defense was, and you were mentioning this, that Ryan Routh had never actually pulled the trigger, but that did not matter. It was the intent, his intent to assassinate then candidate President Trump. Can you talk about the importance of that and how that factors in?
So attempted murder is a specific intent crime, which means that you actually have to intend to kill your victim, and you have to take a substantial step to doing that. So acquiring a firearm, tracking the president, going to the golf course, the days and weeks leading up to this incident, but for, the outstanding work of law enforcement, frankly, and maybe the grace of God, Donald Trump is still alive right now. So that's all more than a substantial step, which is sufficient under the law for attempt. You don't actually have to squeeze that trigger. And there's plenty of cases going back, hundreds of years on this, that is enough for attempted murder. Now, Routh was trying to make this argument that because he didn't pull the trigger, he shouldn't be charged with attempted murder, but that's just not the law. So obviously, that is the most serious count. There are some other counts as well. So when sentencing rolls around, the big factor will be that attempted murder of a presidential candidate, one of the most serious offenses under federal law, which is going to result in a very significant prison sentence. Now, I wonder what Routh is going to argue at sentencing. There's really no mandatory minimum in a case like this, but I fully expect that Judge Eileen Cannon, who obviously was given some favorable rulings to President Trump when it came to the classified documents case, I don't think she's going to grant Routh any leniency whatsoever.
And Nima, you bring up an interesting point because Ryan Routh is going to have a chance to speak his mind at the sentencing. You know, we don't know what we're going to hear, and this is federal court, so cameras are not allowed inside. But who else might we expect to hear from?
I think in a case like this, the only shot Ruth has to get any sort of break whatsoever would be to put on some sort of mitigation argument. And this is certainly not a legal defense. It's not a justification for what he did. But if there are some mental health issues, if there's some sort of explanation as to how he was radicalized and why he wants to do this. Again, I'm not saying that means he's going to get a walk or a slap on the wrist, but that's really the only chance he has of maybe avoiding a life sentence in federal prison. I mean, that's something that good lawyers do in any type of case. Can be a murder case, can be an attempted murder case, or even a less serious case. Obviously here, there's no way that he's going to be able to argue that he's actually innocent or wasn't me. He doesn't really have many good arguments left on appeal. So this is really the only chance he has of potentially, just maybe not getting life in this case.
And Nima, we were sharing with our viewers, it does look like, unfortunately, this camera has now frozen, but it was a live look outside the federal courthouse. And we did see some movement right there as photographers were chasing after an individual who was running away. We don't know who that particular person was. But when it comes to, people inside the courtroom who are hearing this, potentially family members perhaps of Ryan Routh, who might be in the courtroom right now, as we're still, we haven't really seen anyone in the exterior, but who might be in that courtroom?
Obviously, like you said, there's no cameras allowed in federal court, so it's just those courtroom sketch artists. But typically, you would see family members of the defendant, especially during closing arguments and deliberations. Again, this is something that we typically see. If there is a defense attorney, jurors tend to sympathize with defendants that do have that family support. So oftentimes in any type of criminal case, we saw it, for instance, in the Sean P. Diddy Combs case, right? The family members were there almost every day supporting the defendant. That tends to help the defense. Again, obviously here, the different type of case with Ryan Routh because he's representing himself, but that's something that you will see a lot. It's really defense lawyering 101. They want to make sure that their client is not in that orange or colored prison garb. They're in civilian clothes. The family members are there right behind them in the gallery. That tends to at least implicitly help the defense. I'm not saying jurors make decisions based on sympathy, but these are important factors that good lawyers do. So I know that Routh had shadow counsel who was basically on standby, unable to step in if things went sideways. The concern with a self-represented defendant is that the case might become a circus, especially in a potentially political case like this. So I don't know if those lawyers were available as needed, if they were providing advice behind the scenes, but that's something that you would like if you were defending a case like this.